Skyrim is a land defined by power. Empires clash, stormcloaks rebel, dragons return. Everywhere you look, there are factions fighting to prove their strength, their dominance, and their right to exist in a world that seems to reward only the loudest voices. But not every faction in Skyrim is built on strength. Some are held together by fragile leadership. Some rely on secrets that could collapse at any moment. And others exist in a state of quiet instability. One bad decision, one betrayal away from falling apart entirely. These aren't the factions that control cities or win wars. They're the ones barely holding themselves together behind the scenes. Because beneath Skyrim's surface, there are groups that survive not because they are powerful, but because they haven't been pushed far enough to break. And once you start looking at them through that lens, you begin to realize something. Some of the most important factions in the entire game are also the ones closest to collapse. By the time the player is formally introduced to the Dark Brotherhood in Skyrim, the faction is already in a state of quiet collapse, clinging to rituals and traditions that no longer seem to hold the same weight they once did. This isn't the Brotherhood at its peak, not the feared, highly organised guild of assassins whispered about across Tamriel, but a fractured remnant operating out of a hidden sanctuary with dwindling numbers, uncertain leadership, and a growing sense that something fundamental has been lost. And that's what makes them one of the most fragile factions in the game. Not because they lack skill or lethality, but because the structure that once gave them purpose is already beginning to fall apart. On the surface, the Dark Brotherhood still presents itself with confidence. They follow the 5 tenets. They speak of Sithis and the Night Mother with reverence. Contracts are carried out with precision, and there is still a sense of ritual in everything they do. But it doesn't take long for cracks to appear. The Brotherhood you join is small, far smaller than something with their reputation should be. Each member feels less like part of a vast, shadowy network, and more like a piece of something that's been reduced over time. And that reduction isn't just numerical, it's ideological. Astrid, the leader of the Skyrim Sanctuary, embodies that fragility more than anyone else. She has kept the Brotherhood alive, but in doing so, she has also distanced it from its core beliefs. The Night Mother, once central to the Brotherhood's identity, is absent when you first arrive. The Black Sacrament, the very ritual that defines their purpose, is no longer their primary source of contracts. Instead, Astrid relies on personal connections and pragmatic decisions, reshaping the Brotherhood into something more grounded, more controlled, and ultimately more vulnerable. This shift creates an underlying tension within the faction. On one hand, Astrid's approach is what has allowed them to survive in a hostile and changing world. On the other, it strips away the very thing that made the Dark Brotherhood unique. Without the Night Mother's guidance, without the direct connection to Sithis, they begin to feel less like a sacred order and more like a group of mercenaries with a shared aesthetic. And that identity crisis weakens them, because the Brotherhood's strength has never just come from its members. It comes from belief, from the idea that they are a part of something larger, something inevitable. But when that belief starts to fade, everything else becomes unstable. The arrival of the Night Mother marks a turning point, but not in a way you might expect. Instead of restoring the Brotherhood's strength, it exposes the divide that already exists within it. The player as the listener becomes a direct link to the old ways, a role that immediately shifts the balance of power. Astrid, who has led without that structure for so long, is suddenly faced with something she cannot control. And that loss of control is where the faction's fragility becomes undeniable. Her response isn't just resistance, it's desperation. Astrid's decisions throughout the questline reflect a leader trying to maintain authority in a system that no longer supports her. She questions the Night Mother, dismisses tradition, and ultimately makes choices that put the entire Brotherhood at risk. Not because she's incompetent, but because the foundation she built her leadership on is incompatible with the Brotherhood's true structure. She kept them alive, but in doing so, she created a version of the faction that cannot coexist with its own beliefs. And that contradiction ultimately leads directly to their downfall. The betrayal that follows isn't just a plot twist. It's the inevitable result of a faction that has been unstable right from the very beginning. The sanctuary is attacked, members are lost. The Brotherhood, already diminished, is pushed even closer to extinction. And what's left afterward feels less like a victory and more like reconstruction. You don't inherit a thriving organization. You inherit the responsibility of rebuilding something that has already proven how easy it can fall apart. That's what makes the Brotherhood so fragile. It's not just that they can be destroyed, it's how close they already are to that point when you find them. Even beyond the main quest line, that sense of instability lingers. The Brotherhood operates in secrecy, which naturally limits its ability to grow. Its reliance on specific rituals and roles, the listener, the Night Mother, the tenets, creates a rigid structure that doesn't adapt easily to change. When those elements are disrupted, there's no fallback, no alternate system to keep them running smoothly. It's all or nothing. And for most of Skyrim's timeline, it feels like they're operating on nothing, barely holding onto what they used to believe. In the end, the Dark Brotherhood in Skyrim feels less like a dominant force and more like a relic. Something that once held immense power, now reduced to a shadow of itself, trying to survive in a world that has moved on. Its traditions are fading, its structure is unstable, and its future is uncertain. And yet, that's exactly what makes it compelling. Because you're not just joining a faction at its peak, you're stepping into something that's already breaking, trying to hold together a group that was never stable as it claimed to be, and realizing piece by piece just how close it always was to falling apart. They present themselves as righteous, unshakable, and absolutely certain of their purpose. A group devoted to cleansing Skyrim of Daedra, undead, and anything they deem unnatural. The Vigilants of Stendarr walk the roads in plain view, preaching justice, warning of hidden dangers, and offering a sense of moral clarity in a province filled with uncertainty. On the surface, they seem like one of the more stable factions in Skyrim, focused, unified, driven by faith. But the longer you look at them, the more that image starts to fall apart, revealing a faction that is, in reality, incredibly fragile. Not because of what they believe, but because of how poorly equipped they are to survive in a world they're trying to control. Unlike many groups in Skyrim, the Vigilants don't operate from the shadows or behind fortified walls. They are exposed. Their members travel alone or in small numbers, wearing their identity openly, making no effort to hide what they stand for. That visibility is part of their philosophy, a show of conviction, a refusal to fear things they hunt. But it also makes them vulnerable in a way few other factions are. They don't have the numbers of an army, the secrecy of an assassin's guild, or the protection of a city. They rely almost entirely on belief. And belief on its own doesn't stop a vampire attack in the middle of the night. This vulnerability becomes immediately clear when you look at how often Vigilants are found dead. Across Skyrim, you'll come across their bodies on roadsides, in ruined buildings, or near the very threats they were trying to eliminate. These aren't rare occurrences, they're consistent. And they tell a story the game never fully spells out. That the Vigilants are losing. Not in a dramatic singular defeat, but in a slow, constant erosion. Every fallen member is another piece of the faction gone. Another sign that their approach isn't sustainable. But yet they still continue. And that persistence is admirable, but it also highlights a deeper issue. The Vigilants operate with a kind of rigid certainty that doesn't adapt well to the realities of Skyrim. They see the world in clear terms. Daedra are evil, undead must be destroyed, and those associated with them are enemies. There's no nuance, no flexibility, no room for interpretation. And while that clarity gives them purpose, it also limits their ability to respond to more complex situations. Skyrim is not a world of simple categories. Magic is mistrusted but widely used. Daedric artifacts are sought after by powerful figures. Vampires can hide in plain sight. The Vigilance worldview doesn't account for these contradictions, and as a result, they're constantly at a disadvantage. Their headquarters, the Hall of the Vigilant, is perhaps the clearest representation of their fragility. It stands as a symbol of their presence in Skyrim, a central location, a place of gathering, a statement that they are here and they are watching. But it's also surprisingly modest, not heavily fortified, not hidden, not particularly defensible. It reflects their mindset as well, open, confident, and perhaps a little naive. They don't expect to be overrun. They don't prepare for collapse. And then, inevitably, it happens. The destruction of the Hall of the Vigilant by vampires is one of the most telling moments in understanding the faction. It's sudden, decisive, and devastating. There's no prolonged siege, no drawn-out conflict. The Vigilance is simply just overwhelmed. Their base is burned, their members slaughtered, and their presence in Skyrim is effectively shattered in a single event. It's not just defeat, it's an exposure of how little resilience they actually have. For a group dedicated to hunting supernatural threats, they are remarkably unprepared for a direct confrontation with one. What makes this even more striking is how little recovery there is afterward. The Vigilants don't regroup in a meaningful way, most of them are dead. They don't establish a new stronghold or rebuild their numbers. They persist, but in a diminished, scattered form. Individual members can still be found, still following their mission, but the faction as a cohesive force is gone. And that lack of recovery reinforces the idea that they were never as stable as they appeared. Their structure wasn't built to withstand loss. It was built on the assumption that their cause would be enough to carry them forward. There's also an interesting contrast between the Vigilance and other factions that deal with similar threats. The Dawn Guard, for example, emerge as a more organised, better equipped response to the vampire threat. They have fortified positions, specialised weapons, and a clear understanding of what they're up against. Whereas the Vigilance rely on faith and conviction, the Dawn Guard rely on preparation and adaptation. And that difference highlights just how fragile the Vigilants are by comparison. They're not lacking in purpose, they're lacking in practicality. In another version of Skyrim, the Vigilants could have been a dominant force, a structured, influential faction that shapes how the province deals with supernatural threats. But instead, they exist as a cautionary example, a group that stands for something clear and powerful, yet lacks the foundation needed to sustain it. And so they fade, not all at once, but steadily, member by member, outpost by outpost, until what remains is less a faction and more a memory of one. A reminder that conviction alone isn't enough to survive in a world like Skyrim, and that even the most certain groups can be the ones closest to breaking. At first glance, the Bard's College presents itself as one of Skyrim's more refined institutions, a place of culture, of history and artistic tradition tucked away in solitude, far removed from the chaos of the war and political tensions that defined much of the province. It should feel important, a faction dedicated to preserving stories, music, and the collective memory of Skyrim sounds like something that would carry real weight in a world so shaped by legend and myth. But the longer you engage with the Bard's College, the more it begins to feel like one of the most fragile and ultimately insignificant factions in the entire game. Not because it's under threat, but because it barely feels like a faction at all. Unlike the Dark Brotherhood or the Thieves Guild, which are clearly structured and narratively driven, the Bard's College lacks any real sense of cohesion or purpose beyond its surface identity. There are no ranks to climb, no meaningful progression, and no strong internal dynamics that define how the group functions. You don't rise through its hierarchy in any impactful way. You don't gain influence with Skyrim as a result of your involvement. In fact, your role within the college feels almost entirely detached from the rest of the world. You're not shaping events, uncovering secrets, or even contributing to something that feels larger than a handful of isolated tasks. And that's where the fragility starts to show. Because the Bard's College isn't just vulnerable in the traditional sense. It's not on the brink of destruction, nor is it being actively threatened by external forces. Instead, it's vulnerable in a more subtle, structural way. It lacks presence. It lacks impact. It lacks a reason to exist beyond the idea that it should exist at all. In a game where nearly every faction ties into broader conflicts or systems, the Bard's College feels disconnected, almost like an afterthought. Even its central questline reflects this. The most significant task you undertake as part of the college involves retrieving lost instruments, artifacts tied to legendary figures. These are pieces of history connected to Skyrim's past, but in execution they function more like collectibles than narrative anchors. There's little emotional weight behind them, little sense that recovering these items changes anything in the world. They don't alter how people view the college. They don't unlock deeper layers of storytelling. They simply exist as objectives, completed and then forgotten. The burning of King Olaf Festival is meant to serve as the culmination of your involvement, a celebration that ties the college to Solitude's culture and history. It should feel like a moment where the faction asserts its relevance, where its role in preserving and shaping narratives become clear. But even this event feels small in scope. It's contained, predictable, and ultimately inconsequential. The world doesn't react in any meaningful way. The festival happens, and then eventually everything just returns to normal, as if nothing of significance occurred. There's also a notable absence of identity within the faction itself. The members of the college, while individually distinct in personality, don't form a strong collective presence. There's no sense of shared struggle, no internal conflict, no overarching goal that binds them together beyond maintaining the institution. Compare that to other factions where relationships, rivalries, and ambitions creates a dynamic environment, and the difference becomes clear. The Bard's College feels static. Its members exist, but they don't evolve. They don't react to your actions in meaningful ways. They're part of a setting, not a system. Even the concept of being a bard is underdeveloped. You don't perform in a way that impacts the world. You don't use music or storytelling as a mechanic. There's no system that allows you to influence characters, alter outcomes, or engage with the game through the lens of the art. Instead, your role as a bard is mostly implied rather than experienced. You're not told that this is what the college represents, but you're never really allowed to embody it in a meaningful way. And that disconnect further weakens the faction's presence. But what's particularly striking is how much potential the Bard College has. In a world like Skyrim, where history is constantly being written and rewritten through conflict, a faction dedicated to preserving and interpreting that history could be incredibly powerful. They could shape narratives, influence public perception, and act as a counterbalance to the more force-driven factions. But none of that is realised. The college doesn't engage with the Civil War. It doesn't comment on major events. It doesn't position itself as a voice within the world. It simply exists alongside everything else, untouched and unaffected. In a game filled with factions that are constantly in motion, fighting, scheming, evolving, the Bard's College remains still. It doesn't grow, it doesn't adapt, it doesn't demand attention. And because of that, it feels fragile in a way that's easy to miss. Not because it's close to collapsing, but because it lacks the substance that would make it matter if it did. In the end, the Bard's College feels less like a living faction and more like a placeholder, a concept that was introduced but never fully realised. It has a location, a theme, and a basic structure, but it doesn't have the depth or integration needed to stand alongside Skyrim's more prominent groups. And so it lingers, not broken, but barely present, existing in the background untouched by the events that define the rest of the world. A faction that doesn't fall apart, because it was never fully held together to begin with. Few factions in Skyrim present a stronger illusion of control than the Thieves Guild. Operating out of the Ratway beneath Riften, they position themselves as a network of influence, manipulation, and quiet power. The kind of group that doesn't need to fight openly because it already controls the outcome from the shadows. But the moment you step into their world, that illusion starts to fall apart. What you actually find is not a thriving criminal empire, but a faction in decline, held together by routine, habit, and the faint hope that things might return to how they once were. By the time the player encounters the Thieves Guild, it is already a shadow of its former self. This isn't a rise to power story, it's a recovery story. Members talk openly about how far the guild has fallen, how jobs have dried up, how influence has waned, and how their reputation has deteriorated across Skyrim. There's a constant sense that something has gone wrong, but no one fully understands why. That uncertainty is what makes the guild feel fragile from the start. It's not just struggling, it's confused, operating without a clear understanding of what caused its decline or how to fix it. Leadership plays a major role in that instability. Mercer Frey, the guildmaster, is meant to represent authority and control, but his presence feels distant and disconnected. He doesn't inspire confidence or unity. Instead, he creates a quiet tension, a sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface. Brynjolf, on the other hand, carries much of the guild's day-to-day energy, recruiting new members and trying to maintain some level of cohesion. But even he seems aware that the guild is not what it used to be. His optimism feels forced at times, like someone trying to keep a failing system afloat. This imbalance in leadership contributes heavily to the guild's fragility. There's no strong, unified direction, no clear plan for recovery. Members continue their routines, small jobs, petty thefts, localized influence. But there's no sense of growth or momentum. It feels like they're maintaining the idea of the Thieves Guild rather than actually rebuilding it. What's particularly interesting is how the guild's identity has shifted. Traditionally, the Thieves Guild is about more than just stealing. It's about influence, control, and subtlety. But in Skyrim, that broader identity has been reduced. The guild operates almost entirely within Riften, with limited reach beyond the city. Their influence is localized, their operations are now small scale. They are no longer shaping events across the province. They are reacting to them, trying to survive in a world where their relevance is currently fading. This loss of influence is tied directly to their connection with the Nightingales and Nocturnal. As the questline unfolds, it becomes clear that the guild's decline is not purely economic or structural, but supernatural. Mercer Frey's betrayal, stealing from Nocturnal, and breaking the pact that once protected the guild has disrupted the balance that sustained them. Luck, once a defining trait of the guild, has turned against them. Jobs fail, opportunities disappear, everything begins to unravel. And that revelation reframes the guild's fragility in a significant way, because it means their success was never entirely their own. Their power, their reputation, their ability to thrive, all of it was tied to something external, something they didn't fully control. And once that connection was broken, the guild didn't just struggle. It collapsed inward, unable to function without the support it had come to rely on. This dependence is what makes the Thieves Guild so precarious. On the surface, they appear adaptable, capable of navigating complex social and economic systems. But in reality, they've built their foundation on something intangible. And when that foundation is removed, there's nothing left to support them. Even the process of rebuilding the guild highlights their fragility. As the player, you're tasked with restoring their influence, completing jobs across different cities, and re-establishing connections. But this recovery feels kind of mechanical rather than organic. It's driven by player action and not by the guild's own initiative. Without you, there's no indication that they would ever recover. They lack the internal strength to fix themselves. And while the eventual restoration of the Thieves Guild can make it feel powerful again, that power feels conditional. It's not the result of a stable system, reasserting itself, but of external intervention correcting a broken one. The underlying structure hasn't changed. The same vulnerabilities still exist. The same reliance on nocturnal remains. In many ways, the Thieves Guild is defined by that gap between perception and reality. They should be powerful, they should be influential, but they aren't. And that makes them one of the most fragile factions in Skyrim, because their entire existence depends on maintaining an illusion, an image of control that no longer reflects the truth. Once that illusion breaks, once their weaknesses are exposed, there's very little holding them together. In the end, the Thieves Guild isn't just a faction in decline. It's a faction built on unstable foundations, trying to recreate a version of itself that may never fully return. And even when it does, you can't shake the feeling that it could all fall apart again just as easily. Skyrim is filled with factions that appear powerful, assassins who speak in whispers, hunters of evil who walk with certainty, guilds that claim influence over entire cities, institutions that preserve culture and history. But when you look a little closer, that power starts to feel unstable. The Dark Brotherhood is already collapsing when you find it. The vigilance of Stendar are wiped out almost overnight. The Bard's College barely feels like it matters at all, and the Thieves Guild is surviving on borrowed time and broken luck. These aren't strong foundations. They're fragile systems held together by belief, routine, or the illusion of control. And that's what makes them so interesting. Because in a world obsessed with strength, it's the factions that are quietly falling apart that reveal the most about Skyrim itself.